biggest iPhone components, the display with Samsung originally makes, and now the camera edition huge revenue boost for this company. So that's all it is news. Seems like some major dynamic shift is about to happen between Samsung and Apple. What are your thoughts about the mystery iPhone 17 Slim, as well as Apple's possible adoption of medical aspects? Let me know your thoughts. Have a friend. See you guys later. Peace out.
Since the first iPhone in 2007, smartphones have completely taken over society, and there have been an abundance of smartphones released over the past 2 decades, a few of which have been great, some terrible, many mediocre, and some just plain strange. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today we're going to be looking at the top 25 weirdest smartphones ever made. Couple videos on the 25 best-selling smartphones, the 25 worst smartphones, so it only felt right to do the 25 strangest. Now naturally there would normally be a lot of crossover from my worst smartphones video into this one. Too gimmicky, they've got some sort of issue, maybe they push a weird feature like 3D. My last couple videos will be linked in the description if you want to see them after this one, but for the sake of keeping things fresh, these are going to be 25 completely new smartphones, and trust me, some of them are pretty dang strange. Maybe not all of them Kia Ceera Echo strange, but still pretty strange. Also, weirdness is relative, right? So you may not agree with everything on this list. It's not really in any particular order, although I think as we go along, we definitely start to see some more and more strangeness, particularly near the end of this list. But I'm done stalling. Please hit that like button, and let's get started with number 25. Kicking things off at number 25, we have the Motorola Atrix from early 2011. The phone itself at first glance is pretty basic. It was one of the earliest smartphones with 4G capabilities and shipped with Android 2.2 Froyo with that enticingly ugly Moto Blur skin. We're looking at a basic 4-inch TFT display at 540p with the first dual-core Tegra 2 processor and a single gigabyte of RAM powering everything. This was a genuinely powerful device for the time, and it needed to be given the gimmick tying everything together. You see, this phone had some very unique features. Firstly, there was the first ever smartphone fingerprint sensor, long before Apple ever brought Touch ID, so that's pretty cool. Then there's the micro USB and HDMI ports on the side. Computer. Think Samsung DeX for the Galaxy S, except this ran Motorola's webtop platform, which was a Ubuntu-based desktop that did its best to integrate the phone's files and software into a more familiar computer experience. There were multiple docks. First, the multimedia dock, which was basic and allowed for more accessible dock, or a lap dock, as they call it, no joke. It was basically an empty laptop shell for the phone to power, and it would set you back $600. Yeah, you can't pay that much money for an empty laptop. Can't help but feel that money would be better spent on just a normal laptop, but I respect them trying to do something unique. The benefit of them having to beef up the phone to make it work as a middling laptop is that the device itself was very powerful for the time, and it seemed to have received glowing reviews outside of the lap dock, which naturally barely sold. There would be future generations of the Atrix as well, but the entire concept of it was flawed from the beginning. It just never made a whole lot of sense to turn your phone into a laptop when you had to bring around the laptop anyways. You might as well just have a separate computer. And a smartphone is so small, it's never going to be as powerful as a regular laptop. All in all, I think this device is definitely worth being considered one of the weirdest smartphones ever made. one of the weirdest smartphones ever made. At number 24 from 2016, we have the Nextbit Robin. Do you remember those Razer phones? There was only a couple of them, and if this phone looks vaguely familiar, it's because it was made by the same team. Nextbit was founded by Razer only a year after the Robin released, which had followed a very successful Kickstarter campaign and mostly positive critical reception. The phone's design was already unique enough, being plastic with squared edges and bright colors. It is a very friendly looking device, and I've actually done a video on this phone before. The specs here are fairly straightforward. A 5.2-inch 1080p display, 13 megapixel camera, Snapdragon 808 chipset with 3 gigs of RAM, 32 gigs of storage. It was a solid Android phone, and while the design really stood out, it was the cloud-first marketing that makes this device qualify for this list. Now, naturally, having been a Kickstarter phone coming seemingly out of nowhere, that's already strange enough. Not too many smartphones actually ever pan out when they're crowdfunded to begin with, never mind receive $1.3 million from 3,000 backers. But this phone wanted to tackle a problem, storage space, and its method would be free cloud storage for its purchasers. There were some pretty innovative features here, with the phone optimizing storage by doing things like offloading apps onto the cloud when you're not using them, similar to what even iPhones do these days. The software was clean and the experience was pretty ideal, but when you're trusting a crowd-funded company like this, even one founded by creators with some pedigree in the tech space, you need to be wary. Razer bought out Nextbit in 2017, and 2 years after the phone was released, the Nextbit cloud storage would be shut down completely. Still, this was a cool phone with a very unique design, and I can appreciate the ambition. Strange or not, it was a fun device to be sure. Coming in at number 23 and spanning from 2016 to 2019, we have the Motorola Moto Z line of smartphones, mostly coming down to the Moto Z, Moto Z Force, and Moto Z Play with multiple generations. Z or Z debate aside, these phones at first glance are fairly typical Android flagships you would expect back in 2016, but they're made by Motorola, so good chance there's something weird about them. While the 2016 phones received okay reviews for the most part, the fingerprint sensor looked like a home button, but wasn't a home button, which was confusing. The gimmick that was pushed here was modularity. Not unlike the LG G5, though unlike that phone, Motorola actually made an attempt to put out more than 2 accessories, as well as multiple phones compatible with their modules. Called Moto Mods, great name, you had accessories that could be magnetically attached to the phone to add functionality, like a bigger speaker, battery pack, or even projector, all of which were hot swappable, unlike the LG G5. Around this time, modularity was a very popular concept, but there were always inherent issues with it. The reality was, there's not a ton of super useful things you can attach to your phone in this fashion. I mean, past being able to switch up your phone to look at will. While an attachable battery bank could be useful, it makes the phone unwieldy and certainly not an ideal experience. It's also sort of impractical. Do you really need a JBL Sound Boost Moto Mod attached to your Moto Z Force, when instead you could take the money spent on the mod itself and purchase a Bluetooth speaker? Sure, kickstand, but look how thick this thing is. Did anyone actually do this? If so, why? Like the House of Light. This is pretty neat, and the more mods I look at, the more I like this concept. I feel like it's a more robust version of Apple's MagSafe to an extent. Motorola really tried with Moto Mods, and while they were never particularly popular, you gotta give them credit for going all in. Still, a bit weird this ever existed, especially in smartphones as recent as 2019.
Hello, good morning, good evening. I'm Anthony Shaw, and we're going to talk today on Learn Live about data-driven AI applications and multimodal search. I'm going to be showing you a demo that I can put together, which is like a store that's got some AI in the back end, and I'm going to explain how AI can serve a role in like a search capability for a traditional e-commerce store, but like this same rule idea kind of applies in any kind of app. So the target audience for this presentation is anyone who's kind of familiar with AI, but not in the deep technical details in terms of like how to use vectors and embeddings and how to work with different apps and stuff like that. So before we kind of get started, I just want to set a distinction between machine learning, which we've been doing for a long time, and artificial intelligence, because these two terms kind of get chucked in together nowadays, and people talk about AI when they're kind of really talking about machine learning or spotting patterns or regressions and things like that. So machine learning is a type of AI that uses mostly statistics and algorithms to calculate or predict information. And we can use that for things like modeling. We can use it for things like classification, so identifying like types of information, or machine learning is often used for like images and looking at patterns in images for medical studies, or it's used for looking at natural language and understanding text, or we use it for statistical modeling, for things like analyzing the stock market or looking at like outputs of machines and stuff like that. It is highly sort of mathematical based, and is based on algorithms which have been tried and tested for decades and developed. This is an interesting field. AI, on the other hand, can kind of perform slightly more complex tasks, such as understanding, which I've put in quotes because it's debatable whether the AI really understands something, but it can understand natural language. It can do things like recognizing faces or emotions and making recommendations. So it's kind of like the bridge between the algorithms and like the interface that us, the user. Large language models are now kind of one of the huge talking topics over the last couple of years, which is LLMs and GPTs and how that serves a role in AI. They are a form of AI. They're not the only AI. And AI can involve machine learning, and actually mostly does use machine learning algorithms to actually deliver the capabilities such as perception, reasoning, and natural language processing. So machine learning and AI, we kind of talk about ML and AI as being two different kind of fields or different areas, but they're not mutually exclusive. Like machine learning is often used to train AI models, and if you look at how AI works, machine learning is at the core of it. So I just want to kind of set that distinction first before we jump into some more details. So another thing, I mean, actually I'm giving a talk this week at a high school, and I asked the students, they're in the 8th grade, so this is 13, 14-year-olds, how many have used ChatGPT? And I think phones as recent as 2019. At number 22, we have the Asus Pad phone from April 2012, and while conceptually it's certainly not even close to the strangest device we'll see, it still never made a whole lot of sense. On its own, the smartphone seems pretty straightforward and basic. It's got a 4.3-inch 540p display and shipped with Android 4.0 ice cream sandwich. It's a really boring looking phone, but that's the catch. Being a phone is only one aspect of this device, because not unlike what Motorola had attempted with the Atrix, this phone had a companion tablet dock. You had this Pad phone station, which was a 10.1-inch tablet, a very thick tablet that you would stick the phone into, and then you would have a basic Android tablet with an okay at best display. The battery on it was huge at least, but considering this tablet was useless without the phone inside, as in just like that empty laptop shell, this was always going to be a concept doomed to failure. Nobody wants to bring around a tablet that isn't actually a tablet unless you plug your phone into it. If you really loved that concept though, there was also another keyboard attachment to actually turn this thing into sort of a laptop, though the software was still very much Android, rather than the more desktop-oriented experience. Ultimately, what you had here was a pretty mediocre smartphone that made for a frustrating tablet. Things could be inconsistent going from the phone to the tablet, and the specs weren't enough to really handle this sort of thing. There were actually multiple generations here, and as much as it's easy to mock this concept, it must have had some limited success given how many times Asus tried it. Still, there's a reason this idea has been dead for a decade. It was never really practical to carry around an empty shell to enlarge your smartphone experience. At number 21 from 2011, we have the LG Double Play, the first LG phone on this list, but certainly not the last. The early days of smartphones were truly something special, a time when iPhone was around, but the industry hadn't fully yet accepted that a simple display and no keyboard was the sole path forward. We saw lots of weird takes on how smartphones could work around this time and incorporate physical keyboards, including lots of slider phones, and this was one of them, but there's, a second display down there. Running Android 2.3 Gingerbread, the Double Play featured a main screen that was 3.5 inches and not exactly the highest quality. The second sharper screen was 2 inches, and it was there to allow for easier multitasking, at least in theory. You had shortcuts to a select number of apps, 9 apps. You had your choice of 9 apps that you could put on here. Apps that were specifically made to run on the tiny screen, things like messaging, music, notes, and emails. This was a fairly useless gimmick with very little room for customizability or true multitasking, and it also made the physical keypad more cramped, making it potentially less ideal for the audience this would have
generally appealed to. The build was really chunky and cheap feeling, and the compromises here to get that second screen just never were going to be worth it for the very little added functionality achieved. This wasn't the last phone that attempted to incorporate a second screen that we'll see on this list, and there's no question it was strange. Even if I kind of dig the look of the phone for some reason, I think I'm just a sucker for gimmicky devices, and that is exactly what this is. At number 20 from 2003, we have the Nokia 3650. This phone had a lot of firsts. First phone with an integrated camera, so you know operating system featured in a multitude of early smartphones. While it's easy to call practically any phone prior to the iPhone in 2007 weird relative to what we expect from a smartphone today, this one stands out for its circular rotary-style keypad that I guess was supposed to make texting easier somehow, but unsurprisingly all it really did was confuse people. The camera was a mind-blowing 0.3 megapixels, and the phone was probably pretty cool at the time if you could wrap your head around the keypad. Don't forget how these things worked back in the day. If you wanted to type, you had to hit these buttons multiple times to get a letter. Let's just say I'm sure this would have been more difficult to get used to than a QWERTY keypad, or even just a regular cell phone one. The phone would be replaced 8 months after it launched by a revised model with a more straightforward keypad, and that was probably a far better experience for users back in the day. I wanted to at least mention this phone because I do find the rotary concept kind of interesting. Apple themselves had actually prototyped the smartphone with an iPod-style quick wheel, not unlike the joke image Steve Jobs had showed in the original iPhone presentation. One has to wonder how something like that could have panned out. I don't think it would have been good, and this phone is a solid example of exactly why it was just weird to use. At number 19 from 2014, we have the Neptune Pine, our second Kickstarter smartphone that isn't so much a smartphone as it is a smartwatch. Yeah, that was basically the concept. A smartwatch that could act as a standalone smartphone with a micro SIM card slot, a dual-core Qualcomm Snapdragon processor, half a gigabyte of RAM, and 16 or 32 gigs of internal storage. The display was 2.4 inches, and we even had a 5-megapixel rear camera along with a VGA quality front-facing camera. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, this really was a smartphone running Android 4.1 Jelly Bean. Within 27 hours of the campaign launching, Neptune had hit their goal of $100,000 and ended up raising over $800K in 30 days, which made for the highest funding of any Canadian Kickstarter at the time. You could detach the Pine from the wristband to become, I guess, a little easier to use as a smartphone, but if you're already squinting your eyes skeptically, I can't blame you. This was never really a good idea, but don't forget, while smartphones by 2013 to 2014 were fairly well established, smartwatches were still a new and foreign concept. The Apple Watch hadn't been announced yet, and there was a gap in the market for a product potentially like this to really take off. And I mean, well, there was never a second model, so you can probably guess how it went. The battery was small, the camera quality was mediocre, both the device and even Watch Band itself was clunky. Android 4.1 was already out of date at launch, performance was middling at best. Look, if you ever used a lower-end Android from the early 2010s, just imagine that experience on a 2.4-inch display. Yeah, not great, and the biggest claim to fame for this device was probably being featured in 2017's Fast and Furious 8 for some reason. Overall, weird smartphone and not a great smartwatch, but still, someone had to give it a shot. And Canadians that sentence hurt to say. This is a stupid joke. At number 18 from 2015, we have the BlackBerry Priv, which is one of many BlackBerry phones that could probably qualify for this list. At first glance, it looks like your typical 2015 Android phone. We've got a nice 5.4-inch 1440p AMOLED display that's actually curved on the side, pretty cool. Up to Android 6 Marshmallow, an impressive 18-megapixel rear camera, a Snapdragon 808 chipset, and 3 gigs of RAM. This is a slick-looking phone front to back, and the curved screen really makes it feel premium. This is a BlackBerry. I'm using BlackBerry using keyboard, and sure enough, we've got a physical keyboard here on a slider. While slider smartphones were a dime a dozen in the early days, the Priv stands out for being from 2015. And I actually love this phone. I did a video on it years ago, and I'm probably going to do another one, because forget the device itself, the keyboard is just way too fine to jiggle in, out, in, out, in, out. This was actually BlackBerry's first Android phone, as they've been using their own operating system beforehand, and had security enhancements that was a lot more appealing than their prior models, thanks to actually having access to the Google Play Store. Though the audio for a physical keyboard was extremely small even by 2015, still the keyboard actually does feel so you can do some gestures without actually touching the screen. The main grid was said to stand for privilege and privacy, and it definitely was priced on the higher end, which probably didn't help with it failing to meet sales expectations, though it wasn't really a flop per se either. The biggest issue with these sliders is that you're using a significant amount of space for a gimmick that doesn't appeal to that many people to begin with, and this would mean compromise in other areas. Plus, with a physical mechanism like this, there's always potential for getting dust and debris inside and causing issues down the line. It wouldn't be BlackBerry's last hurrah, though their Key 1 and Key 2 wouldn't see much more success. I love this phone, but there's no question it's pretty strange, and there's unfortunately a reason BlackBerry doesn't make phones anymore. At number 17 from 2011, we have the aptly named Pantech Pocket, another relatively early smartphone that was attempting to evolve hardware in a unique direction. Specifically, the Pocket was wider than almost any phone on the market, not taller, mind you, but wider, making for this sort of square-ish design. Thing is, there's a reason phones got taller rather than wider as time went on. It's because it still lets them be relatively easy to hold with one hand. And sure enough, the 3:4 ratio of the 4-inch 600p TFT display was apparently clunky and uncomfortable to actually use, at least if you had smaller hands. The design here is sort of interesting. You've got that textured, rubbery plastic backing, and the software features Pantech's own skin on top of Android 2.3 Gingerbread. Pantech was a South Korean company that generally made more budget-oriented devices, and this one clearly was meant to stand out from the crowd. And it does, though I'm not sure it's for the right reasons. Also, fun fact, while I did find a Wikipedia article for this phone, it was specifically only on Wikipedia Netherlands. Not sure why, maybe the Dutch really like this phone, but the article, just like this phone, is so short anyways, I don't think it really matters. basically 4 modes, even allowing for what was essentially a handheld camcorder. There's 2 displays, and the N90 could almost be mistaken for a flip phone if you didn't see the big camera lens that could also be swiveled. The main display was 2.1 inches and surprisingly high resolution for the time, and the phone was all powered by Symbian OS as you would expect. The camera was 2 megapixels, which sounds unimpressive now, but for some perspective, the first iPhone 2 years later would also have 2 megapixels and no video recording capability, meaning this phone, as far as the cameras go, was actually more versatile. And the phone's cool and all, but it was also expensive and big and heavy and just all-round chunky. It wasn't the future of smartphones, but it was a unique idea, and I can't help but kind of want one. Yet another innovative device from Nokia that never really went anywhere, but is still cool looking back. In 15th place, released 2013, we have the LG G Flex. And there's plenty of LG devices that could make this list if I really wanted them to, and this one certainly deserves it. The LG G Flex was an Android tablet that was very similar to the LG G2, except it had the unique quirk of featuring a flexible display, allowing for the entire device to be curved. The screen itself was OLED, 6 inches, and a kind of low-res 720p. It was polycarbonate plastic, with the buttons placed on the back of the phone right below the camera, classic LG design. Apparently, the rear backing is that's okay. We don't need to talk about the Galaxy Z, which was a smartphone size projector camera, or the Samsung Continuum. Yeah, there's actually a lot of strange Samsung phones from the early years. I did want to give a shout out though to the real obscure phones. Phones like the ZTE Z20, I think. This one was sent years ago and it had a 7 screen on the back. It wasn't a full display, unlike the Yoga phone with an e-reader display. It's just the normal touchscreen on the back of the phone because, I guess, I looked at the Galaxy Z and that was a pretty cool phone. There's just lots of really weird this last tab. But I hope if you're enjoying it, make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Let's get right back into this Mate XT Ultimate. Over the past half decade, we've seen plenty of quick phones, some of which were disasters, but as a whole, foldables have gotten much better, especially in recent years. A phone like the Galaxy Fold was arguably already weird on its own. Certainly the concept was novel when it came out originally, but at this point, I think we're all pretty used to this sort of device. So how do you shake things up once again? How about a tri-folding phone? The Huawei Mate XT has the unique quirk of not just unfolding once, but twice, so you basically get 3 smartphone displays connected into one big tablet. It's a really cool concept, and while the clearly iOS-inspired software skin may not be the most ideal, the hardware is still very impressive. The phone works in 3 modes: as a single screen, as a more normal size foldable, and then you can unfold it one more time for that ultimate tablet experience. It doesn't exactly look normal from the back either, with this huge camera setup featuring a 50 megapixel main shooter alongside a 12 megapixel ultrawide and telephoto. Price-wise, you're looking at around $3,000 US. Not that you'll be able to actually buy this in the US, given that it's from Huawei. Overall, at the moment at least, this is a very novel phone. It remains to be seen whether or not these tri-fold phones ever actually catch on, in which case, like foldables of the past, this will no longer be that weird, but for now at least, I think the Mate XT deserves a spot on this list. At number 11 from 2016, we have the Caterpillar Cat S60, and I'm not sure if I knew that Cat stood for Caterpillar before this, to be honest. I feel like I probably should have known that, but it's worth a single eyebrow raise, I think. As you would expect from Cat, this was basically the definition of a rugged smartphone, a device built for anything, and I do mean anything. Aside from having a weird, bulky build, it was also the most waterproof phone ever at the time, and also the first phone to ever have a built-in thermal imaging camera, which is extremely cool. There have been a good few Cat phones over the years, and this wouldn't be the only one to include a thermal imaging camera, but for a feature phone like this with such a niche gimmick to even exist, for those this appealed to, this was the absolute perfect smartphone, and there was nothing else quite like it on the market. Ultimately, the last Cat phone would come out in 2023, with the phone maker shutting down in early 2024. These devices still have a level of demand though, and having something like that thermal camera, normally you would need a dedicated device for that, which could cost upwards of thousands of dollars. Just having that feature means this phone will continue to retain relevance for users as long as it still turns on and functions. Weird phone, but I kind of love it. At number 10 from 2014, we have the Sharp Aquos Crystal. Anyone remember this phone? It was arguably more of a concept device rather than one truly built to sell, but it was still extremely impressive by 2014 standards. The phone was very plain from the back with only a single 8 megapixel camera sensor, but from the front, we're looking at a nearly bezel-less display along the top and sides, with only a big bottom bezel hosting the selfie camera and microphone. Note, there's no speaker for phone calls, which normally would be on the top bezel. This phone uses an odd in-ear sound wave receiver, which channels sound waves to your inner ear, thus avoiding any need for a proper speaker at the top of the phone. This isn't unique to this device, but it's still very uncommon, and apparently the quality was mostly lacking here from the reviews I've read. Basically, while this phone looked cool, it's not one you would want to actually use if you made a lot of phone calls. This was still very much a mid-range smartphone despite its futuristic design. The 5-inch display is only 720p, pretty rough for 2014, and the rest of the specs were just as middling. It was also priced in the mid-range, at least however, which isn't what you would expect from a decade-old phone that looks like this. I would argue being from Sharp in the first place is kind of weird. You don't really think of them when it comes to smartphones, but they have made plenty of them over the years. Overall, very cool proof of concept, and certainly a phone deserving of this list. concept and certainly a phone deserving of this list. At number 9, from also 2014, we have the Vertu Signature Touch. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but whatever. It was a phone that would cost you the meager price of around 11,000 US dollars. No, really, 11 grand for this thing. The design was very luxurious, as you would expect, with classy materials like titanium, genuine leather, and sapphire. I would also say the design is a bit much. Clearly, Vertu doesn't follow the Apple mentality of minimalism, though if you're spending 11 grand, I don't suppose you'd want them to. The actual specs are fairly standard for a flagship smartphone of its era. Snapdragon 801 processor, 4.7-inch 1080p display, 13 megapixel camera. The build is thick and heavy, and there were plenty of different finishes to choose from, including a blue lizard skin option, apparently. And this is all well and good, but clearly none of it amounts to a smartphone worth so much cash, and that's where the main gimmick comes into play. These days, AI personal assistants are much more relevant and more useful than they've ever been, but they still can't actually replace a human. But with the Signature Touch, you get Vertu's concierge service, which amounted to 24/7 access to a real human who could essentially act as your assistant, able to do things like make restaurant reservations, or high-end exclusive bookings or purchases you may not have had the means to do by yourself. Of course, you're still bankrolling all of this, but the service would come free for a year with the purchase of the phone, and it would cost $3,000 annually afterwards. Having constant access to a human capable of doing the dirty work an AI might struggle with is an interesting proposition, and one I find dumb, and definitely not worth 11 grand. But then again, I'm making YouTube videos for a living, while the actual owners of these phones, assuming anyone bought them, are probably much better off. So, you think I could get one of these assistants to write a video script for me? I kind of wonder, but regardless, extremely weird phone with a weirder backstory behind it, and it all makes for a perfect fit as one of the weirdest smartphones ever made. At number 8 from 2018, we have the Palm phone. And this really is a weird one, both for the history behind it, as well as the device itself. If you know smartphone history at all, you'll probably recognize the Palm name. And you may be aware Palm hadn't made any devices branded after them since 2010. And yet, in 2018, here's this tiny little device popping out of nowhere, promising to be an ultra-mobile companion, used in conjunction with your main driving smartphone. The hope here was to capitalize on those who wanted to distance themselves from how much time they spend on their phone, while still having a device they could bring around with them anywhere. The size is what stands out the most, with a tiny 3.3-inch 720p LCD display. Not ideal for your actual smartphone, but as a companion piece it might make sense. Other specs were fairly standard: USB-C, IP68 water resistance, 12 megapixel rear camera. Power was limited with a Snapdragon 435 chip and only 3 gigs of